Welcome to Podcast 5 of The New Way. Let's begin reading today what John wrote in John 1:10. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. Now, of course, the he is referring to Jesus. The word recognize has two different meanings in common usage today. When we recognize someone, we note their identity from their outer features. We've seen them before, and therefore we recognize them the next time we meet. The Jews had never seen Jesus, so I don't think that that's the meaning that's used here. The second meaning is to acknowledge or recognize a legitimate claim for some accomplishment or title. Jesus was their creator. He was their God. They should have known or recognized his legitimate claim, but they didn't. So when John says that the Jews didn't recognize Jesus, I believe he was saying that many didn't acknowledge his legitimate claim as their Messiah. Let's look at John 1:11. John 1:11 says, "He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him." Jesus came to the Jews first, because God had carefully prepared the Jewish people for his coming. You see, almost 2,000 years before Jesus came to earth, God had chosen a man named Abraham to begin preparation for Jesus to arrive. Isn't that amazing? Abraham's grandson was named Jacob, or Israel. We've already talked about his 12 sons becoming the nation of Israel, or the Jews. God had selected them to be like a cocoon in which to birth Jesus. He sent them prophets and leaders to guide them and provide them with all the necessary information so that they could recognize Jesus when he arrived. There are over 300 prophecies concerning Jesus recorded in their scriptures, what we call the Old Testament of the Bible. God's intention was to use the Jews to bless all the nations of the world with this knowledge of the Messiah. God called the Jews his chosen people because he had such a special job for them to do. Jesus was born into the earthly Jewish tribe of Judah. So the Jews were his own people. Many did receive him as their Messiah, and John writes this in John 1:12 through 13. John 1:12 through 13. "Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision, or a husband's will, but born of God." Now, this statement also made the Jews upset and was very confusing to them. They already considered themselves to be God's chosen people. They believed that just by being born into a Jewish family made them sons and daughters of God. In one sense, that is true. Everyone who is born physically is in some way a child of God, because God is God and everything belongs to him. But here, John states clearly that you can't be born into God's family with just a physical birth. You must have a spiritual birth too, even if you are Jewish. We'll talk more about this as we continue our study, and it's okay if you don't understand it. Now we're going to look at John 1:14. Verse 14 says, "The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth." The best way I know to describe this verse is through a story I heard a long time ago. I don't usually quote other authors, but I think this is such a perfect description of this verse. You can hear this story read better than I can read it by the author, Paul Harvey, on YouTube. He does a much better job than I can, but I'm going to read it here. So relax, listen to the story, and I think it will better explain these verses. Here goes. The Man and the Birds by Paul Harvey. The man to whom I'm going to introduce you was not a Scrooge. He was a kind, decent, mostly good man, generous to his family, upright in his dealings with other men. But he just didn't believe all that incarnation stuff which the churches proclaim at Christmas time. It just didn't make sense, and he was too honest to pretend otherwise. He just couldn't swallow the Jesus story about God coming to earth as a man. "I'm truly sorry to distress you," he told his wife, "but I'm not going with you to church this Christmas Eve." He said he'd feel like a hypocrite, that he'd much rather just stay at home, but that he would wait up for them. And so he stayed, and they went to the midnight service. Shortly after the family drove away in the car, snow began to fall. He went to the window to watch the flurries getting heavier and heavier, and then went back to his fireside chair and began to read his newspaper. Minutes later, he was startled by a thudding sound, then another, and then another, sort of a thump or a thud. At first, he thought someone must be throwing snowballs against his living room window. But when he went to the front door to investigate, he found a flock of birds huddled miserably in the snow. They'd been caught in the storm, and in a desperate search for shelter had tried to fly through his large landscape window. Well, he couldn't let the poor creatures lie there and freeze, so he remembered the barn where his children stabled their pony. That would provide a warm shelter if he could direct the birds to it. Quickly he put on a coat, galoshes, tramped through the deepening snow to the barn. He opened the doors wide and turned on a light, but the birds did not come in. He figured food would entice them, so he hurried back to the house, fetched breadcrumbs, sprinkled them on the snow, making a trail to the yellow-lighted, wide-open doorway of the stable. But to his dismay, the birds ignored the breadcrumbs and continued to flap around helplessly in the snow. He tried catching them. He tried shooing them into the barn by walking around them, waving his arms. Instead, they scattered in every direction, except into the warm, lighted barn. And then he realized that they were afraid of him. To them, he reasoned, I am a strange and terrifying creature. If only I could think of some way to let them know that they can trust me, that I am not trying to hurt them, but to help them. But how? Because any move he made tended to frighten them, confuse them. They just would not follow. They would not be led or shooed because they feared him. If only I could be a bird, he thought to himself, and mingle with them and speak their language, then I could tell them not to be afraid. Then I could show them the way to the safe, warm barn. But I would have to be one of them so they could see and hear and understand. At that moment, the church bells began to ring. The sound reached his ears above the sounds of the wind, and he stood there listening to the bells, Adeste Fideles, listening to the bells, pealing the glad tidings of Christmas morning. And he sank to his knees in the snow. In his service, Dale.